This is a common discussion organized by the European Platform for Democratic Elections, the EPD, a network of 14 European citizen election observation organizations with its secretariat in Berlin, and ZOiS, the Center of East European and International Studies, one of the leading Berlin-based think tanks with a focus on Eastern Europe. Yesterday was a day of suspense and a night of repression. After the decision of the Central Election Commission not to register two of the strongest competitors of Alexander Lukashenko for the presidential elections, police forces detained more than 200 peaceful protesters in Minsk and in several other Belarusian cities. We have altogether around about 1 hour to reflect on what does that mean for the upcoming elections in Belarus, for the future of the Lukashenko regime, and for the EU-Belarus relations, but most importantly, for the Belarusian society. I'm glad to present the speakers to you. The speakers, firstly, Vladimir Lapkovich. Welcome, Vladimir. He's from Minsk now in our chat room. He's a lawyer and election expert of the human rights organization Viasna. He's an initiator, by the way, and a former board member of the European Platform for Democratic Elections. Michael Georg Link, a member of the German Bundestag from the liberal fraction FDP, and from 2014 until 2017, director of the ODIHR, of the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Warsaw. Welcome, Michael. Nadia Douglas and Felix Grawacek, they are both researchers from our partner organization in this discussion from the ZOiS. They are working on the region, and they will present us their two recent researches on current social developments in Belarus. But we are not alone here. We have registered participants, almost 80 persons from different European countries, from all over Europe.
Разных европейских стран.
Poland, from Germany, from the European Parliament in Brussels.
Из Польши, из Европарламента, из парламента.
We cannot see each other due to our technical restriction, but we are glad to have you all here. Welcome to everybody. I think we will have an interesting discussion altogether. I will briefly make some technical introductions, three technical remarks. First, we have a Russian-German translation language selection you find on the lower bottom of your screen, Dolmetsch, and you may select either English or Russian language, or you may just listen to the original language. Comments we can take via the chat function, so please use the chat function and send your comments and send your questions in writing. We will pass them further to the discussants. And thirdly, that last remark, we will register this discussion, and it is already sent in live stream, and you will find the discussion also on the social media of both of ZOiS and of the EPD. So my first question goes to Vladimir in Minsk. You have been observing elections in Belarus for years. What is the difference of these elections compared to the previous campaigns? How can you assess this election process today?
Добрый день, коллеги, добрый день.
Well, good afternoon, my dear colleagues, and Stephanie. Thank you for this question. And well, answering, I must say that undoubtedly, this is the kind of campaign that we had never before had in Belarus. First of all, it is related with the fact that we have seen an unprecedented, never seen before action of the Belarusian society and their desire to take part in the electoral process. The Belarus society, as a matter of fact, is very much politicized. And if before that we have seen some sort of apathy and an unwillingness to influence the actual state of affairs, a very relaxed approach to the authoritarian regime already set down in Belarus, in this year, the situation is entirely different. There is a reason for that. There is a new generation that has come to the fore, one that, well, I must say, Lukashenko has been ruling since 1994. This is like almost the second generation of people growing up now who have absolutely grown out of the shoes of the old authorities, which are still rooted in the Soviet past. Of the Soviet times, Belarus is rather archaic in undertaking the approaches of those young people who are in this active phase of their life in the society. Obviously, yet another influence was the COVID pandemics. We have to note that the reaction of Belarusian authorities to the epidemics was, softly speaking, shocking for the society. Since, well, the authorities have all but ignored the threats, they have maximally hidden and have been hiding the actual size of the pandemics, and the countries have been maximally dealing with the COVID distance. But the official mass media were directed at laughing at the issue of the epidemics and laughing at other sites which have introduced a quarantine. At this very same time, the society has seen virtually the real picture where all their friends have fallen sick so far and go down with COVID, and many families, that's still a problem of those issues, and the issues of their deaths also appearing. There's a fear of epidemics, which is still followed by the inadequate reaction of the authorities. And of course, there's a psychological protest towards the authorities in the Republic of Belarus. All of that has been visible in the fact that the authorities have been very much active in supporting the opposition candidates. We have to note here that the classical political position, which has been active in Belarus for over 25 years, well, basically, it is very much weakened and is no longer an alternative. And it cannot function any actual agenda. Therefore, here we can see some new candidates rising. First of all, there's the rather strong candidates which have the past in the nomenclature. The example of Valery Kalov, he was one of the top workers in the IT infrastructure of Lukashenko's administration, creating those parks of high technology, is one of the basic top managers when the state was attempting to implement their IT technologies and receive the profits for these technologies as well. Viktor Balabarika was a top banker from Belarus, one of the very high bankers. He was also the head of the bank. Well, Russian one still, but he himself was rather Belarusian centric. He was an important overseer for the Belarusian humanitarian national and local projects. At the very same time, he was also one of those who returned the works of art to the Republic of Belarus, who is a rather important and rather positive intelligentsia, persons related with the Belarusian culture, and their appearance was absolutely unexpected that a single Belarusian political scientist managed to predict the appearance of such interesting candidates. We, as the campaign on elections, when we modeled this campaign, we thought it rather dull, typical, and not overly influencing of the Belarusian society. It turned out quite differently. It was one of the largest and interesting electoral campaigns. One has to note that, unfortunately, this campaign immediately started growing in terms of its level of general interest and the politicization of the society. The authorities, unfortunately, found no other answer than the most traditional one, was the one for repressions and violence towards the participants of the electoral campaign. And that obviously is very tedious, since that basically puts under threat all those attempts to normalize our EU and West relations, taking into account the growing pressure against Belarus. And this selection of the authorities is very much detrimental to Belarusian society. So stepping aside from any dialogue with political opponents, from any dialogue with those who are critical towards the authorities, well, the authorities suddenly decided to put it all on the sword's edge, thanks to the violence apparatus, against the first state. The main role in the formation of the political agenda of the day in the country are played by the forcible structures, and as of the given moment in Belarus, we only have 25 political prisoners. It has to be noted that one of the main bloggers, who was also one of the presidents of the people, have spoken of the desire to step up as a presidential candidate, was arrested. First, his wife is right now a presidential candidate, Sergei Tsikhanovsky, was arrested in Grodno after a strongly falsified basis of evidence. Together with him, we have a pogrom of the independent bloggers who have become much more popular than the classical mass media. And these bloggers have also been en masse detained. The candidate Viktor Babarika was also detained. He is also charged with not paying taxes and with whitewashing money, and he is basically right now in a isolator of the Committee for State and National Security. As of the given moment, 25 have been detained, those whom people saw as the ones that need to be released to political prison, because the whole situation tends to show us that the authority was definitely interested and had this political motive in the opponents being detained, and that undoubtedly was the wish to get rid of them as the main important competitors from the electoral process, which was basically done yesterday. Some of the candidates were refused the registration, one of them. It's right, that is Viktor Babarika, as I've already said, basically on the very initial. That was already seen as the basic violation of documents division on the declaration of the actual time. And in a given case, he was refused his registration as a presidential candidate. Similarly, Valeria Sobkova did not receive her registration either. She's an IT manager and a former public servant. Her refusal was she refused to give down the letter which was given by the requirements of the Belarusian law. It has to be noted that the government is under full control of the Electoral Commission, which is formally without any basis for the pluralism consequence. It's a closed down administrative procedure fully found under the control of the local vertical, which is right now responsible to the presidential administration. And all of those commissions are right now fully closed. The formation was also done in the rather closed off form and was not pluralistic in any way. Therefore, we have seen a full degradation of the electoral procedures in Belarus, even those which were and are formally seen in our legislature. All of them are right now en masse being violated during this electoral campaign. We have seen the use of the full administrative resource in collecting votes for Alexander Lukashenko. They were usually gathered under the pressure of administration of the management at the place of work, and we have to know that it was a rather large economic sector in which is state-owned. Therefore, the people understood that one of the main employers is the state, and therefore, under the pressure of the administration of their own working places, were forced to sign for the president. It has to be noted that a very important aspect is obviously the mass activity of the of our citizens during the peaceful process. We have never seen anyone that those collecting those elections signatures would be standing in such long queues, thousands of people queuing for a whole day under the sun, wishing to give their signatures for the first time to the basic presidential public candidate who was that popular. It was rather not difficult to collect the signatures, but basically we thought it was impossible. Even those candidates who were popular, who never received, unfortunately, their registration, since the society wished for them to run. It was first of all that we heard of those records, such as the one that the candidate Paprika or gathered over 400,000 signatures according to our law. You only need 100,000 in order to have the possibility to run as a presidential candidate. Basically, yesterday, the willing of those was basically circled over, coming from the purely political motives of the authorities. Also, quite an important aspect that we deem rather negative of the elections was that the Belarus authorities, for the first time, did not invite the observation missions of the OSCE. No. So that here yesterday it was stated officially that unfortunately they cannot already organize this mission, but still there is no invitation. The invitation was sent in advance always. They were sent to the technical mission, and right now there will be no observers. The main observers will be the national observers, including ours. And of course, we understand our responsibility. We understand the fact that, fortunately, I think for that to say that the Belarusian authorities wishes for the self-isolation and no one coming in from the outside. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. So you mentioned already some key differences to previous campaigns. Higher level of repression, not admission of candidates to the election, and last point, not invitation of the International Election Observation Mission of ODIHR to Belarus. This is an unprecedented situation in Belarus. Belarus always was very careful with invitations and was inviting ODIHR in a due time. This is the first time that there's no invitation, and ODIHR has reacted today and declared not to send anymore due to the late time, no more mission. So these elections will definitely not be observed by ODIHR. Michael Link, do you expect an erosion, a destruction of the OSCE system of mutual election observation? How can OSCE react to this situation? Is it a unique situation, or is this a trend? Should we be aware of some sort of trend in that? What would you assess? How would you assess this situation now?
Thank you very much, Stephanie. First of all, let me thank you very much for setting this up. It's really, really, really important to speak as much as possible on these issues about Belarus, especially because the worst thing we could do is simply to be quiet, to sit and to assist while what is happening in Belarus is happening, and let it happen without consequences. People there are struggling and they are fighting for their human rights. And I thank very much Vladimir for his words and for his description of the very dire situation, also highlighting the differences maybe and another development since last time. What you mentioned now in terms of international electoral observation, well, certainly the fact that Belarus did not invite is, or at least played with the invitation, coming very late with some signals, that is indeed a very, very, very bad signal. And I'm very glad that ODIHR decided now to say very clearly, too late is too late. Election observation, I can't repeat it often enough, is a methodology, is more a science than politics. It's more a methodology to follow, and you simply cannot start it 1 week ahead or even going only for electoral day. It is a very comprehensive approach. It is a set of rules, by the way, internationally agreed in a series of agreements, both in Vienna, in OSCE, in the so-called modalities, but also when you look to Parliament, to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, or to the European Parliament, also enshrined in a whole set of rules. That all these things have been blatantly violated, in this case by Belarus. It should be highlighted, it should be noted. All of us who hoped again and again that there will be a little bit of progress have again been disappointed. I'm personally not disappointed, and probably you you as well are not disappointed, because we had to expect moves like this from President Lukashenko. He is playing, as we all know, again and again with this back and forth of contacts, conversations, trying to signal things what some people in the West would like to hear, or in the European Union would like to hear. But already with his constant, of course, non-willingness to enter into any meaningful dialogue with the Council of Europe, for example, or on the death penalty, signals that he's not really ready to change something. And that is the unfortunate truth. What we can do now, especially, is to really protect the instrument of electoral observation, because I'm afraid, unlike Vladimir said, there will be international observers, but fake observers. There will be international observers from the Russian Federation, maybe from Azerbaijan, maybe from Armenia, whatever, or Turkey. They will be invited on a bilateral basis by the parliament of Belarus. And they will then in the TV, in the Belarusian state TV, they will then, of course, give some assessments, probably positive, very positive even. And so the impression can be made that there was an observation. But let's be very clear, these fake observers, they are only privately invited by one member state, or in this case, by one state. And this is not living up to the standards of internationally mandated electoral observation. This is a little bit the game behind the game, because not only Belarus, also a lot of others, and thanks to EPDE, Stephanie, thanks to the work of your team, we know a lot on these fake observers. Many member states are doing this, but this is now something beyond Belarus only. And coming back to Belarus especially, I can only say that I have a lot of respect, of course, for all those who are taking to the streets and taking to the streets to protest for their human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for this assessment. Indeed, fake election observation is another threat to the integrity of elections, and we all have to stand together to detect it, to name it, and to sanction it also. This is a task also for the German. Yeah, to sanction, to protect the elections from that. And this is also a task, by the way, for the German Bundestag, to develop instruments to safeguard its own reputation. Thank you for this comment, Michael. I want now to pass the word to Nadia. Nadia, you have been researching on dynamic of protests. Is a very actual topic now. We heard there is increasing protest mood in Belarus. Vladimir mentioned that young people are looking differently at their society. Maybe they are interested, maybe they are ready to protect elections, to become more active, to become observers, to work there. What is your observation? Would you share your assessment with us, please, Nadia?
Yes. Thank you, Stephanie. And first of all, also thank you to our guests, Ola Menakovic and Michael Link, for their insights and important explanations. I'm very glad that we scheduled this event today on time. It's a very timely event, I would say. I would like to give a brief overview of protest dynamics and police reactions. And I would start with underlining that those recent events show to us that also in Belarus, more gradually than in other post-Soviet states, we can observe a growing discrepancy between a new generation of young generation of emancipated citizenry, as Ulla already mentioned, and authorities that are still stuck in a very paternalistic power structures and Soviet-style mentality. So this is obviously per se a very volatile constellation. And in Belarus, this citizen-police relationship is quite emblematic for the problematic. And this has become evident again during those protests on 19th of June and as of yesterday evening again. where on the one hand you have those young folks on the central Independence Avenue of Minsk and in other cities, clapping, filming, forming human chains, and on the other hand you have the OMON troops dragging peaceful demonstrators in civilian minivans. So these ongoing protests and obviously those that we're expecting to come are the latest in a long series of upheavals surrounding elections. We already heard 2006, 2010, there were also protests after the elections. In 2017, we had the decree number 3 issued by Lukashenko, de facto punishing the unemployed and triggering the first real social protests, countrywide protests in Belarus. So the protests and also the brutality and the repression by the police were also anticipated this time, but we did not expect this to happen so early. And I would say the major differences compared to previous years and previous protests is that these predominantly young protesters and activists, they are not anymore so much of the underdogs or part of a subculture as previously. Usually when we observed protests, we had these people that, pensioners, unemployed people that have nothing to lose, and people that are full-time activists. So today it's different because young people are not so intimidated anymore by the idea of ending up in pretrial detention or being fined with administrative fines, because they know they can rely on or they are reassured that there are solidarity actions and people that launch crowdfunding to assist them with the fines. So how does the police act during these public assemblies? The Belarusian militia also kind of transformed a little bit due to digitization. So they're very active also on Facebook and Twitter. They read, they know when protests are happening. And what they usually do is before planned meetings or rallies, they arrest key figures or opposition figures they know that would maybe organize or lead the events. So this time they did this already during the presidential campaign with former presidential candidate Nikolai Statkevich, or the leader of the Malade Front, Pavel Severinets, besides those detentions of presidential candidates and their campaign staff. So during protests, they film what police does also in other countries, but they also track telephone numbers and thereby try to obtain data, personal data from protesters. And afterwards, as I mentioned, they revert to arbitrary arrests, detention, and administrative fines. To conclude, a couple of words about the development of internal security in Belarus. In my current research project, I argue that Belarus has quietly transformed from a social welfare state to a state dominated by domestic security concerns. And as a matter of fact, Belarus has a bigger number of militia, meaning police and internal troops, than armed forces. And there you can already see where they see the main enemy. So moreover, they have also the highest police density rate in Europe. And this security apparatus, the Siloviki elite, has recently gained even more power and influence and relevance in the regime. There are several concrete indicators. We could also discuss this later on. Notably, I would mention the appointment of high KGB officials to keep posts in the administration. And also in the run-up to the election, there has been a lot of work to prevent domestic destabilization. So, for example, President Lukashenko in December 2019 assigned a new national defense plan that namely focuses on the prevention of domestic instability. Having said this, there's also evidence that the loyalty towards the regime among security structures is not so unconditional anymore, and there seem to be lower and mid-level rank officers that have been quite vocal online already and they don't want to be anymore part of this oppressive apparatus. So but this seems to be still a minority. And I would finish here.
Thank you, Nadia, for that. Is quite coinciding with the assessment of Vladimir also, and the political assessment of Michael, that we have seemed to observe a situation where the regime goes into a trap or a one-way road, not leaving the path of dialogue and of reconciliation and going into a confrontative situation, which will be difficult to come out. It should be a topic for our discussion where we see such ways out. Would like to come back to this question later. And now I would pass over to Felix. You have renewed your research on the mood of young people, social attitudes of younger people in Belarus. It would be interesting to hear your assessment now on the current situation. It's from July, I understand, July this year, so very fresh data. And it would be also interesting to hear how you gathered this data in Belarus, in the situation, the current situation. So maybe a brief presentation of your findings, Felix. Thank you.
Great. So I'll share my screen. I hope that this works. So we've already mentioned the intergenerational divides that become ever more apparent kind of in the relationships between politics and society and within different generations of society. And at ZOiS, we've been able to conduct a third survey now among young urban Belarusians, one in 2019, 2020, and now the last one that you've just mentioned, late June, early July, in the run-up to the election. And what we can find there is kind of nicely echoing what the three previous speakers have already said, is a high degree of politicization that can be observed at the moment. So if we ask about whether you're interested in politics, we see an increase of an average now nearly 60% of young people stating that they have an interest in politics, which is kind of the generational change. It's the debates, the dissatisfaction with the COVID-19 politics, but also obviously a very exciting electoral campaign that at some point seemed to offer a real choice. And in that context, we also observe a remarkable increase in the frequency of political discussions that young people state that they have. But interestingly enough, we don't get a sense that there's an increasing disagreement. So that could suggest that if there are pockets of young people who kind of share certain political views and then discuss politics, but within certain pockets. And this politicization translates into a high interest also in the presidential elections. So nearly 76% are either very interested or rather interested in the presidential election when we asked late June, early July, and almost 80% intended to participate in the election itself. And the big question, of course, in the room then is if this awakening of political interest among young people is rather ephemeral, so will it vanish rather soon, or will it persist beyond this window of opportunity that an election itself creates? These politicized young people, where do they draw their information on? Kind of, we anecdotally, of course, know that they rely on social media, but it's really hard to know to what extent they really do so. And I have a question on media usage there, and so nearly 85% state that they rely on social networks or various online media, and kind of all the other media outlets, kind of, they're negligible, maybe apart from international media, which still gets 5%. And when you dig deeper into, well, what are these social networks and the online media? So it's Tutbay, which is the most prominent one, followed by platforms such as Telegram, Instagram, YouTube or Kontakt. Yeah. We've also included a question on the vote choice of young people. So there we had the list of candidates that tried to get registered since the survey ran over the last late June, early July. And young people are quite clear in terms of their vote choice. So we get 45% of young people who would want to vote for Babarika, followed by Tsepkala with nearly 13%, and Lukashenko gets 10% of the votes of young people. What is also interesting, if you follow up with, well, why would you want to vote for these candidates? The majority of young people actually say that these two candidates that were barred from running in the race represent their political opinions rather than just a rejection of the status quo. So they seem to these two people seem to embody also really a sense of change that young people are looking for. And as you can see, all the other candidates that are allowed to run in the election get very small results. And what is quite important is that the option against all, which kind of would be an easy exit option in an authoritarian context, was only chosen by 3.2%. Last point is the one that Nadia made on political mobilization. So we've seen in the media and kind of social media and so on, a high degree of protest with, in particular, young people. And that translates in interesting ways across the young generation. So nearly 90% of young people know about protests that took place over the last 12 months. That's an incredibly high number. In nearly 19%, 18.5% know people who protested. And these effects are really important because participating in protests is first and foremost an effect of a network. So knowing someone else who went and protested is kind of the most important predictor for participating yourself. When we ask more directly about, well, did you get involved in protest? The numbers are, of course, much lower, but that might also reflect a certain fear of giving an honest answer to such a question. So the direct question, did you participate in protests, gets a 5% compared to the 19% who know about people who protested. So where does this leave us kind of in the big picture? Kind of a survey shows us the extent to which the social contract seems kind of broken in the country at the moment. If we look at the trust in key state institutions, we see a significant erosion already from February to June 2020. So within 1 year, the averages, as you can see from the president, have declined significantly, but it's the same for the security forces and the police, obviously in the current repressive context, but also the army, which is usually an actor that gets kind of rather positive assessments across all of Eastern Europe. So I think what is interesting is that this young generation is no longer afraid to speak their minds. We get that when they go on the streets and protest, and we also can see that in surveys where they are quite open, also in the kind of textual questions, telling us about their opinions and almost desiring more, having more frequently the opportunity to express themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Felix, for this interesting, insightful, and quite clear picture you draw of the mood of younger people on protest. One question to Vladimir, and another question to Michael, and I also encourage our audience to write their comments or questions in the chat. A question, Vladimir, do you as an institutionalized civil society, as a human rights organization, do you can you get feedback of what Felix has been describing and Nadia? Do you have an interest in organized human rights work? Do you feel interest from younger people to join, for instance, election observation, for instance, human rights monitoring? Do you feel that as an institution in Belarus? And my second question to Michael Link, there are not so much politicians in the German Bundestag who know Belarus so well as you do, from several visits, from working there, from being ODIHR director. What is your idea? How can we encourage further? How can we encourage the democratic moods in the country? How can we support these tendencies? How can we, at the same time, prevent conflict, prevent this sort of brutalization which is going on now? Do we have any assets? Do we have any stakes in that as Western partners? First question to Vladimir, and then to Michael.
Yeah. Очень коротко.
Just very briefly, I just want to note that our observation is not scientific, but it is in full correlation with what Nadia and Felix mentioned on the situation, especially if speaking of the youth. And as a first run, it is explained by the fact that, well, we have been observing since 2009, but we have never seen such a large number of volunteers who have signed into our campaign and who want to observe the elections. For example, in 2015, there were the presidential elections, which were one of the most dull presidential elections in Belarus, but we had below 100 volunteers, not even 100 over the whole campaign, who wanted to observe since if we even had the very same as we have now, and we had the very same campaign in the social networks, to come about right now, 3 weeks before the election, we have almost 1,500 observers who have signed in, and that is not yet all. Obviously, yesterday's events are getting more and more, and I know the main thing that it says is that these are people who are not members of any government organization or political parties. This is the new generation, the new people who want to realize their civic activities. We, as a human rights organization, have managed to create a rather strong network of volunteers who are helping us in our daily work to protect the elections and electoral rights. And the fact is that the product of the last year, the last 2 years before that, we didn't have this kind of feedback, this kind of reaction to our actions. And now that happens, that is happening, the verge of those political changes that we have. So basically, all of that, on the one hand, is very good. On the other hand, all of that is rather responsible for those institutionalized status issues. So basically, this call to volunteers is visible in all the organizations of Belarus, and the fact that even Nadia mentioned in her presentation was the crowdfunding issue. We have for the first time seen, for example, sometime over a week for the help for the political prisoners, we've managed to gather some $100,000. If we're speaking of dollars, and that basically is, well, we understand that there's a rather wave-like situation. It cannot be a permanent source of income, and we cannot expect it to go on, but it still shows us the unprecedented signs of solidarity which is present in the society. Thank you.
Michael, how can we catch up? How can we assist maybe in a peaceful, more or less peaceful solution of this conflict situation in Belarus?
This became much more difficult because of the increasingly repressive nature of the regime. We all thought there is already a maximum of repression, but we hear there is always a plus, there is always more repression possible. And thanks, by the way, from my side, very much to Nadia and to Felix for their analysis, especially the data which you collected on the ground. That is very, very important for us. It's a grim picture. We don't have a lot of leverage from the outside, but at least the first step we should do is we should not make it easier to manipulate, for example, the instrument of electoral observation, or to give Lukashenko possibilities to portray himself still as the one stability factor of the country. Something unfortunately is still resonating with some people in the West. This is really something we need to delegitimize. That means, for example, if a member of the Bundestag or of the European Parliament, or let's say the French Parliament or so, goes, and that taking up your point, Stephanie, what you mentioned in the last round, if somebody goes to an unrecognized international observation by the invitation, for example, of the Belarusian parliament or by the Belarusian government, then this person should be banned from further attending any electoral observation in the future, wherever, whenever. That is what we do elaborate right now in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, in the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly. And I add to that, we should also think about internal rules in the Bundestag, also maybe shaming or naming, especially naming these persons publicly who do violate the very reputation of the German Bundestag by attending such measures. Of course, you can never fully control, but of course you should have consequences. That is important. In addition to that, for Belarus concrete, we really need to think of formats how we as Bundestag, and by the way also the German government, which should really do that, maybe even more than now already, of really bringing Belarus to the attention of a broader international public, both, of course, highlighting human rights issues when we speak with circles in the corporate world. Earning easy money in Belarus should be really something which we discuss with the corporate world, because still, of course, a lot of business and investors are there. I think this is something which we should really table, this issue. And of course, we should try to find ways, even if difficult, to channel help. And that's not already money, that's always money. That's especially moral and other support and political support to NGOs, to civil society in Belarus, including, of course, academic institutions, research institutions. We need to be creative. We from the parliament will do whatever we can in that area, but I think it's foremost on the government level and the EU level to use more their official channels. I will be very, very curious to see how the Russian Federation will react to this time on these elections. A lot of speculations have been going on the reasons behind the public disputes between the Russian Federation and Belarus. Well, I think in the end there's a lot of theater there, and we should maybe really focus more on the very facts on the ground. And that's why I'm happy that ZOiS is staging this. I, for my part, will try to do what I can. I am issuing a press statement today on behalf of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, where we clearly condemn what Belarus is doing. I'm there, the vice chair of the Human Rights Committee in the OSCE, and we really need to be vigilant and not to close our eyes. Quite on the contrary, to speak more about Belarus as much as we can.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think this is two important points to find good ways how to support our partners in Belarus, striving for democracy, but also caring for our own credibility and caring for our own house. And this is very much appreciated and acknowledged, I think, by our colleagues in Belarus. So it's something we have to work on. Thank you for that. Now, with a couple of questions to Felix about the methodology. This was also my question. Maybe you can briefly explain, is your sample representative for young Belarusians all across the country, education-wise, etc.? Question to Felix. And question to Vladimir. How do you assess the support Western donor countries during the campaign? And how citizen observers perceive the current situation where there are no observers, international, this is meant international. This is an important question, I think. These are two questions to Vladimir and first to Felix. And then there is, and I will read it now because we are running to the last 10 minutes, so I will add the third question. You note your questions, Felix and Vladimir. Dear participants and panelists, there is an appeal for solidarity with Belarusian civil society directed to the German government. Okay, this is something you will, the other participants, they will find in the chat, so you can have a look at that. So please, Felix, maybe to the methodology, and Vladimir, the assessment of international assistance.
Sure. So the survey is based on an online sample of Belarusians living in the major cities. So it's impossible online kind of internet penetration to get to the rural areas, but it's representative for the 6 largest cities. And the recent June-July survey for people aged 18 to 34, so those who are voting age, the 2 previous ones that we ran were for people aged 16 to 34. The surveys are representative in terms of the educational attainment of people, and also their income and the occupations are kind of reflecting the broader picture of Belarusian society. The only people you can't get at with this kind of survey work is state employees. So that's something that kind of you would need to factor in. But beyond that, kind of these surveys are a fairly good way of getting a sense of what population thinks. And online has the advantage of giving some degree of anonymity, of course, because if you've got a person visiting you at home in the current Belarusian context, I mean, it's not particularly likely that people will speak their mind, whereas online, kind of people are increasingly used to speaking their political views via social media and via the screen. So the online survey is a very convenient tool for getting a sense of the political mood.
Thank you, Felix. It is important to know we all suffer still from the termination of ESEPS, Mannheim's Sociological Institute, in 2016, and I think this is a big lag now, and any interesting and methodologically clear efforts to come back to sociological data from Belarus is very welcome. So thank you really for this effort. Vladimir, could you answer the questions about the assessment of support from Western donors and how citizen observers perceive a current situation where there are no international observers? Vladimir, with включите, can you switch on your mic?
Да, извините. Мы, конечно,
I'm sorry.
признательны.
Well, obviously, we are very grateful for this attention, for the statement from the international community that's already been spoken regarding Belarus. For us, the very important thing is that we do not have the repetition of the 2010 situation, where in response to the full mass brutal repressions of the Belarus authorities against the participants of the presidential election and the participants of electoral processes, a response to that, we have seen sanctions which virtually hit the whole of Belarus, sanctions from the US and European community. For us, it's important the situation doesn't repeat itself. Everything depends on the pure willingness and the responsibility of the authorities. And basically, they should refrain from any forms of repression. It's very important. The international society in context with them gave a clear message that the very situation that we have right now with the level of threat against the peaceful person and the most problematic issues of the political prisoners basically leads to sanctions being introduced against Belarus, and therefore the authorities should have a full clear understanding and should immediately be able to come back to the zero option that is before the initiation of the electoral campaign, where the political prisoners in Belarus were only amounting to 1,000 people and were not in any way connected to any specific political opponents of the authorities, no specific participants of the electoral process. So basically, if we don't do that, everything will slide down into repression again. It's very important that international society is in contact with the Belarus authorities, that it should have a clear-cut signal in this part that basically the not inviting of the foreign observers is a very risky, very mistaken form of self-isolation. So what pertains to the civil observation, we understand the kind of responsibility that has been laid down upon us. So right now we are the only arbiters. And basically, insofar as Belarus is in line with international standards and the obligation, but we are still hoping that the Belarus authorities will not use against us, independent observers, any kind of repression as we saw it in 2010, where unfortunately we were also the object of repression. That is very important, that the further on the government, the authorities should refrain from any violent actions against independent observers. We all understand that the duty, both the mandates and our missions, independent of the observation that we have taken upon ourselves, we, as I hope, will still do quality work with our international society. We'll have information enough that we'll be able to gather as to what extent the elections in Belarus are in line with the national standards in the area of freedom of speech and free election. Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir. I don't see any more questions in from the chat. Maybe a last question, political question to Michael Link about Vladimir mentioned sanctions is no good solution. Nobody wants sanctions, but how do you assess the situation, political reaction to the already existing now repressions we observe in Belarus, and to the breach of the use of inviting international organizations to election observation? How do you assess a European reaction? What can a European reaction be in order to be credible, in order to be if we compare the situation to 2010?
Well, I'm for my part, I'm pretty sure that personalized sanctions do have an effect. Contrary to what we hear again, for example, when it comes to personalized sanctions against the Russian Federation because of the Crimea and Donbass, contrary to what they say, they always complain about it when you speak to them. So that has an effect, certainly. So when it's about sanctions, I am very much prefer personalized, very concrete sanctions instead of hitting or targeting whole parts of economy or society. Let's not forget, also when I speak with people of the business world, of the corporate world, we want the economic exchange. Economic exchange was certainly very good, but of course we want those who invest or have business interests in countries like Belarus or Russian Federation to be aware of the situation, of the human rights situation. So, and not to be blind-eyed. So for the sanctions, very clearly, I prefer the personalized ones. And here, the European Union indeed maybe has some room for additional aspects, and especially having a potential for adding some persons there on the list, which would very concretely hit them. In the chat, there were two questions directly to me. Very briefly, the German Belarusian parliamentary group. Well, I'm not aware of what the group currently is doing, because I myself am not a member of this group. I'm myself a member of the German-Russian group, where we have a lot of things on our plate. Stephanie knows what I'm talking of. That is a long story, and I would be very interested also to follow on the Belarusian group, but according to my impression, they are very not so active. But that is, of course, because of the partners on the Belarusian side. If you don't have a meaningful dialogue, and only if you're only lectured, then of course the whole group is a little bit worthless. Nevertheless, it should be used to be outspoken, to mention in these conversations, especially in the internal ones, in no uncertain terms, our expectations and our criticism. And the other question was on the AFD observers to be expected to come again to Belarus. Well, I mean, it would be not surprising to see them again there. Some of them from the German extreme right-wing party AFD. I think they will even do more. Maybe you saw lately that some MPs, especially one MP, even met in Minsk when he was there, representatives of Donetsk and Lugansk. And as far as he's also a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, he pretended in some way to speak for the Council of Europe, and then, of course, meeting these Donetsk and Lugansk people. That is outrageous. That is appalling, and this needs to have consequences. That is why I addressed this in the Council of Europe as well. I mean, they cannot simply use the name, the trademark of Council of Europe, and then sit together with Donetsk and Lugansk. That is very bad. And unfortunately, Lukashenko's regime and the parliament are tolerating all this. They are tolerating all this, and this also needs to be addressed and to be mentioned. The last point in the chat, the petition. Thanks for that. The petition to the German government. I, for my part, don't know yet know anything about the answer from the German government side. But we have a cross-party coalition, very large here, from Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, Greens, and Liberals, where we, in the Foreign Policy Committee in the Bundestag, are, that I can guarantee you, very much aware of the dangers of what is happening, and we are not naive. Unfortunately, AfD and sometimes also our post-communist party, unfortunately, they really watered down the very essence of what is happening there. That's a pity. But the four of us, let's say the more center ground political parties, we will continue to table that. And if the government is not clear enough, we will certainly criticize that.
Yeah, thank you very much for this answer. I did not find it. It was not in the chat. It was in a question and answer. So thank you very much, Michael, for giving directly the answers to these questions. Also, I thank you very much, all the participants, or the panelists, for your insightful contributions, for the research, Felix and Nadia, for your political assessment, Michael and Vladimir, for your courageous work. Important work. We wish you all the best for your election observation, hopefully with new courageous people bringing new evidence to the procedures in Belarus. And thank you very much also, Michał Gorkowski, for the perfect translation in English-Russian. It was a pleasure to talking to you. We will follow up to the situation in Belarus and wish you all the best for your processes and try to think about new ways of working with you. Have a good afternoon, everybody, and see you again. Bye bye. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Спасибо за организацию. До свидания.
Всего доброго.